Louis Riel and the Metis. Louis Riel and the Metis, with the emphasis on the Red River Resistance. To start, you want to think about what does the idea responsible government mean to you? You may want to pause the recording at this moment to write down your thoughts. However, responsible government essentially means it is a government which is accountable to the people. Typically that means through an election. However, Louis Riel was a controversial figure in Canadian history. On one side, he was viewed as a martyr because he essentially led the creation of the province of Manitoba to join Canada. But on the other side, he is viewed as a traitor and a murderer because of the Thomas Scott affair and the fact that he led two armed rebellions against the Canadian government. Now, speaking about the Canadian government, in 1867, as you can see on the map, it is a loose, leftover, bureaucratic colonial mess. On one side, you have the original four provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, but there are colonies such as British Columbia, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island, the Hudson Bay Company controlling Rupert's Land, which is kind of like the Canadian Shield, and the Northwestern Territory that had everything else. It was very disorganized, even though the Americans down to the south were very much organized. The Red River Rebellion, or Resistance, are names given to events surrounding the actions of the provisional government established by the Métis leader Louis Riel in 1867 in what is now referred to as the province of Manitoba today. The resistance was also the first crisis that John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, had to deal with after the establishment of Canada. Now, the Red River was part of Rupert's Land, which was part of the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company had this land for 200 years, but had to sell it to the Canadian government because they had only 200 years with this year lease, and because of the fear of American expansion to the south. Because of those reasons, the company sold the land to the government, and the government sent William McDougall, who was an English-speaking governor, to the land to establish Canadian law authority. Because he was English-speaking, he was opposed by the French-speaking inhabitants of the Red River settlement of Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land, the Red River settlement, has several groups of individuals: First Nations, the Métis, the Selkirk settlers, and a few others. It was not a unified place. As you can see from this image, Riel became quickly the leader to represent the people who had gone to the point of referring to this land as their ancestral territory. Now, what does the term provisional government mean? And the ideas behind it. Essentially, William McDougall wrongfully declared that the Hudson Bay Company was no longer in control of this territory, a claim that was disputed by the inhabitants of this land as they never really had truly accepted the company had ownership of this land in the first place. The Métis in particular viewed the Red River settlement, because of the pemmican trade, as their ancestral territory. As a result of this, though, the Canadian government asked for the transfer of the sovereignty of this land to be postponed. For those reasons, Métis, with their leader Riel, created a provisional government, a decision that did not sit well with the English-speaking settlers who lived there as well. Upper Fort Garry would become essentially the command post for the provisional government. The fort, which was part of the Hudson Bay Company, was a logical choice as it was a defendable position and the largest building in the land. Now, what is a provisional government? A provisional government is when a previous government collapses or there was no longer a government in the place. Essentially, a provisional government is a government temporary. It is there until a full government can be established. This was done because Louis Riel took Johnny Macdonald's hesitation in transferring ownership as a void of his leadership, and therefore he was within his right to start ruling the Red River settlement, today's Winnipeg. Riel's government included Metis, Aboriginal, and non-Aboriginal peoples. This is a rather famous picture in Canadian history with that. Once again, you may want to pause so you can find where Riel is in the picture. If you see that he is in the middle, you are correct. The Métis do not refer to as Manitoba or the Red River with those names. They refer to it as Assiniboia. And early on in the resistance, Riel negotiated directly with the Canadian government to establish Abyssinia as a province. And early on, the negotiations were going well. But something happened to change that. And what that was, it was the Thomas Scott Affair. Louis Riel's men had arrested members of a pro-Canadian faction that had resisted his provisional government, including an Orange man, an English Protestant named Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott was not a model prisoner, and he even threatened to kill Riel if he was given a chance. This provisional government was acting on the behalf of the people of the Red River to negotiate with the Canadian government. As a result of that, Scott was put on trial and executed by firing squad for offenses usually considered as non-capital, essentially not usually worthy of the death penalty. But he was still sentenced to death. In this painting, it shows the true crux of the issue of Louis Riel and the Red River resistance. For good or for ill, this marks another example of how in Canadian history, our history is dominated by English politics or French politics. From these two paintings, you can see as a primary source which one viewed Riel as a murderer of Thomas Scott and which one viewed Riel as carrying out the lawful authority by his government. Bear in mind, the Métis have French ancestry as part of their background. After Thomas Scott was put to death, feeling he was no longer safe, Riel enlisted his old priest, Father Noel Joseph Richaud, to negotiate with Canada on the behalf of the provisional government. And soon, both sides had reached an agreement. The agreement was in 1870, the Manitoba Act was passed, which allowed the Red River settlement to join Canada, the Confederation, as the province of Manitoba. Additionally, with the establishment of Manitoba, the Act also gave some of Riel's demands, such as separate French schools for the Métis children and to protect Catholicism. But you might wait and think to yourself, hold on, does this mean that because Thomas Scott was executed, that makes Canada a province for the territory of Manitoba? Yes and no. Both are correct, both are wrong. It's a strange result. You have to think about it in the big picture. With Thomas Scott being killed, Manitoba is now part of Canada. With the fear of the United States to the south, the Canadian government essentially had alternative motives. First of all, they had to get control of not just the Red River Valley, Manitoba, but the entire Rupert's Land, the Canadian prairies. They had to get control of it because of the American aggressive expansion going down in the south. Because of that, the Red River Expedition was sent from Ontario to Manitoba to establish and enforce Canadian law, Canadian authority over this land. As you can see with this picture of the expedition going over the Kakabaka Falls in 1870. But as word of the death of Thomas Scott reached Ontario, many Ontarians demanded this expedition should be used to arrest Riel and to suppress what was viewed as a rebellion, even though in Quebec, the people there did not see this the same way. Essentially, the rebellion would end once the expedition arrived and established Canadian law and authority in now what used to be called either Assiniboia or the Red River Settlement. It's now called Manitoba. It marked the end of the rebellion, and with Riel gone, the Canadian government exiled him from Canada for a span of 5 years because Riel had fled down to the United States. You got to think about this in the big picture. On one side, yes, a person was killed, but from the Canadian government's point of view, they were willing to accept the demands of the Métis for the schools, the language, etc., because they want to establish their authority, they want to block the American expansion, and most importantly, the Red River, also will be known as Winnipeg, will become a critical, important part of a new project. That project being the Canadian Pacific Railway, a project that will link this country from sea to sea with a new technology that had been developed back in England during the Industrial Revolution of the railway. The death of a person and giving in their demands was a price worth paying because the government was in this for the long term. And as we explore into the following topics, you will see the critical role that the railway would have and the change to the people and the landscape the railway would represent. And that is why we look at this point.